Welcome to the Colony Archive, a review and analysis on the politics of empire and resistance. Earlier, I was joined by Geo Maher to talk about the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, by the U.S. states. Geo Maher is a writer, organizer, and educator based in Philadelphia, USA. He has taught in universities across the world, including Drexel University and the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas, Venezuela. He has also written extensively on Latin America and Venezuela, including his book called We Created Chavez. His latest book is called Anti-Colonial Eruptions. Gio, thanks so much for joining us. I actually taught your book, We Created Chavez, in Pakistan, and the students liked it very much. It was a very informative book. And as I think the audience knows, there is a war going on right now between the U.S. and Venezuela, with the Donald Trump administration abducting the Venezuelan president in violation of international law and the UN Charter. And I think you are one of the best voices to inform the English speaking world about what is happening in Venezuela. Welcome to the Colony Archive, Geo.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Sure. And so I think what's really great about your perspective is that you have both a historical and contemporary perspective. So you're very informed on what is happening right now, but you also know about the history of European and Western colonization in Latin America. So I'm wondering, as a starting point, can you tell us about the similarities or the differences between a Spanish colonization and the American imperialism against Venezuela that we're witnessing today?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And it's a great backdrop to thinking about Venezuela today. And you know, we can look at colonialism as unfolding in a series of stages that are not separate or distinct, but are actually kind of interlocking. Of course, in the Western Hemisphere, Spanish colonialism occurred very early, beginning, in the 16th century. And it was, the sort of later wave of colonialism that maybe we're more familiar with, British, and other Northern European colonialism, emerged later and also emerged as a reaction to, right, through this sort of mythical construction of what was referred to as a Black legend, which demonized Spain for in a way, being the truly barbaric colonizer, the truly violent and brutal colonizer, thereby cleansing the hands of the Northern Europeans, who, of course, were doing much the same, if not in many cases, much worse. And then if we think of these things operating then in conjunction with a later shift to U.S. imperialism, you have, still more sort of hand washing, processes that allow for U.S. imperialists, and this is really the context that we're seeing reborn today in the sort of return to this discussion of the Monroe Doctrine, being presented as actually saviors of the Western Hemisphere. Now, of course, for the most part, if we're talking about a lot of Latin America, we're talking about direct transition from Spanish rule to U.S. domination. Right, the ostensible freedom of an early wave of decolonization in the early 1800s then gives way very, very quickly to U.S. Domination by a neo-colonial and directly colonial means. So you have, in cases like Puerto Rico and Cuba, a direct handover where there's an independence struggle in the 1890s that is then scooped up by the U.S. In a, what we're often taught is called the Spanish-American War, but of course was the War for Cuban Independence, for example, that was hijacked then by the Americans, and the seizure of colonies in that process. So the direct transition for many, but for the rest, you have this sort of casting of a cloud and a shadow across the hemisphere under the ostensible protection of the Monroe Doctrine. For those who are not familiar, the Monroe Doctrine, which is first sort of issued in the mid-1800s and then really fully comes into effect into the late 1800s, presented itself as a claim of defending the Western Hemisphere from European intervention, right? And of course, Europe was trying to intervene, but the United States was not a sort of beneficent partner in this relationship, And so we gain and sort of inherit from that Monroe Doctrine this phrase, the sphere of influence, right? That the U.S. has the right then to intervene. And of course, 1898 is when those interventions begin in earnest. And then the 1910s and the 1920s are a period of direct marine landing, intervention, attempts to annex territory, and U.S. domination of the region. That is precisely what Trump is very explicitly evoking today. He spoke of the Monroe Doctrine when he announced the Venezuelan incursion. He spoke of this return to the Monroe Doctrine, what's often being referred to as the Trump corollary. And what's very interesting is that Trump is doing a series of slightly bizarre and contradictory things, one of which is to attempt to convince part of his base that is anti-intervention, that something like the Monroe Doctrine, which focuses on the U.S.'s backyard in the Western Hemisphere, in other words, our sphere of influence, is different from other global interventions, say in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes, and I mean, he also called it a Don Roe doctrine, so he's definitely drawing on that. And what's really crazy to me is that if you look at the legacy media and the mainstream Western media and the Zionist media, they don't present this as a continuation of naked colonialism and the kind of the level of entitlements they have to Venezuela. So they don't even say that Maduro was kidnapped or abducted in violation of international law and UN Charter. Rather, they say that he was captured. So I think there's this imperialist hubris, but at the same time, they're not talking about this in the language of colonialism, and the media doesn't talk about it that way. But getting kind of going from the issue of colonization to what happened before the coup, some context for our audience regarding the Bolivarian revolution and the Bolivarian government. So can you talk about how the Bolivarian government came to power in the 1990s, and what are some of the politics of the Bolivarian revolution?
Certainly. And I would say, just as, for the sake and for the purposes of broad backdrop, that all of the tendencies that we see emerging out of colonial occupation and domination, right? Whether it's Spanish colonialism or then U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism, all of those tendencies exist in Venezuela, and because of the oil economy, they're sort of exacerbated still further, right? By that, I mean the absolute distortion of the economy toward the global market, the geographic distortion, what Fanon called the hypercephaly, the macrocephaly of the urban areas, everyone moving to the cities to be close to the oil wealth, the political distortions that emerge as a result of colonialism. The geographical and territorial arrangement of Venezuela is historically incredibly colonial, right? So the process in Venezuela has to be understood as a process of decolonization. And that is built into Bolivarianism from the beginning, right? It's built into the very name. And the idea of Bolivarianism was not simply the idolization of the great independence leader, Simon Bolivar, but it was actually an idea that emerges, and you have to understand the history to understand this. It emerges from the heart of the armed struggle in the 1960s, where Venezuelans were looking for new sources, domestic indigenous sources in Latin America for revolutionary theorizing and understanding. And they turned to the figure of Bolivar, not as the single leader, but as a sort of umbrella for thinking through indigenous sources of struggle, Afro-Caribbean indigenous sources of struggle, the struggles of maroon communities and indigenous communities against colonization. So that's built into Bolivarianism from the 1960s and into the 1970s. Now, what then happens is the brutal decade, the so-called lost decade of neoliberal structural adjustment, which is imposed in, of course, a neo-colonial way across the region by the IMF, the World Bank, hand in hand with the United States, which meant the sort of brutal imposition of austerity and the kind of violent imposition of starvation onto many parts of the region. The promise, of course, was that wealth and prosperity would follow. It's referred to as the lost decade because that was not the case, right? So when we think about something like the pink tide that emerges then in the 1990s and into the 2000s, we're talking about something that emerges as a dialectical reaction to the imposition of neoliberal reforms and structural adjustments. And that's very clear in Venezuela. The origin point of the Bolivarian revolution in the near term, right? This was already sort of developing, it was already percolating, but the origin point is a mass rebellion in 1989, and that rebellion is precisely against structural adjustment. People took the streets, lit things on fire, sort of rioted across the city. It's called the Caracazo in 1989, and that was the origin point because it said that this could not continue, right? A reaction to neoliberalism imposed, of course, as part of a broader neo-colonial project. That's 1989. Then Hugo Chavez attempts on the eve, on the sort of anniversary, originally scheduled anniversary of that mass rebellion, attempts a coup in 1992 that fails, but in the course of that failure succeeds, by which I mean Chavez is sent to prison, but he becomes a symbol of the struggle that begins to develop a broad Bolivarian movement across the country, and he's then elected in 1998. That election then brings forth a process which has several stages. The first stage is in some ways slightly more reformist, the rewriting of the Constitution, the attempt to rebuild the country on different foundations, and then gives way by 2006, 2007, and into 2009 to a radical process of decolonizing the economic structure of Venezuela by building, direct democracy at the grassroots level that then is connected to direct institutions of socialist governance, by which I mean the communes, right? This is ultimately the project of Chavez that he's pushing, right up to his death, which is the creation of what he refers to as a communal state, the directly democratic management of a local economy where people get together democratically to participate, to decide what gets produced, to live in equality and to manage their own affairs, right? That communal state is the legacy of Chavez. Of course, Chavez dies in 2013, and economic crisis is almost immediate. A series of incredibly unfortunate dynamics set into motion the profound economic and then political and now military crisis that's been going on for well over a decade in Venezuela. But up until that point, the Bolivarian Revolution stood for not only the liberation of Venezuelans, not only the restructuring and the replacement of a sort of corrupt and brutal oil state and neoliberalism with directly democratic socialism, but it also stood for a global revolution, right? And Chavez, of course, is revered in Palestine, in North Africa, in Latin America, across the global South, as someone who was willing to support, as the Cubans had before, liberation struggles across the global South.
That's right. And I mean, what's really curious to me is this kind of binary between, authoritarianism and democracies. And the idea is that, these supposedly authoritarian states are so bad that the democracies have the right to intervene and topple them. But my impression from your book, We Created Chavez, was that he's not an authoritarian leader in a sense that, he comes to power in a way that, he's the only man who's running the show. Rather, the people, including the indigenous people and the Afro-Venezuelans, created Chavez, as you argue. So can you also tell us about whether this authoritarian versus democratic framing is correct or not, and how you would characterize Maduro? Was he an authoritarian leader, or was he something else?
I think, I think there are a few interesting things that need to be said. Like, one is that first and foremost, Trump stands, as the representative of a contemporary tendency that sees liberal democracy as having, become a thing of the past, right? The way that Trump is operating, the way he is attempting to transform the political structure responds very directly to the idea that liberal democracy does not meet the needs of political governance in the present. Now, we don't agree with Trump, in many ways, but there's also an incredibly important left-wing version of this, which is to say liberal democracy has not saved the poor of the planet, right? So when we're talking about authoritarianism versus democracy, we need to understand that, Trump is certainly himself turning toward authoritarian solutions to attempt to push forward his own project. But I actually think that the category of authoritarianism is close to meaningless. And by that, I mean, Venezuela is a really good example of it, right? One of the main difficulties of the Maduro presidency since 2013 is an absence of authority, is the inability to sort of in a single-handed way move the government in one direction or move the political project forward. If anything, Maduro lacked the kind of authority that Chavez himself was able to claim. But as we know perfectly well from history, from the teachings of even Max Weber and other sort of classical political theorists, authority is something that is gained and is earned. It's not a sort of specifically and explicitly a form of government, right? Chavez had a great amount of authority because he could leverage power, because he could transform society. And that was precisely what allowed for him to then press forward this directly democratic project. So you have something that looks like a paradox under Chavez where people talk about the centralization of power or authoritarianism. And yet what is being done is that Chavez is leveraging his own capacity to push a political project to to empower grassroots democracy against an entrenched bureaucracy, right? And it's precisely that kind of entrenched bureaucracy that has become more powerful in Venezuela in recent years, and which has come at the expense of grassroots movements. So again, authoritarianism tells us very, very little. And the flip side of that, of course, is that the heart of the political project in Venezuela is and has been communal democracy, meaning grassroots democracy, meaning a very different kind of democracy, which doesn't simply operate on the level of voting once every 4 years for oligarchic, representative of a two-party system. It means participating at the grassroots level. It means really having a role to play, in how your own life operates. Right now, I won't, exaggerate that communal democracy is a project. It is a project that never, has never been at the center of Venezuelan life. It has never gotten the support that it requires and needs, but it was the project of Hugo Chavez. I want to be very, very clear about that. So you've got clashes which don't operate strictly on the level of democracy versus authoritarianism, because you have different kinds of democracy and you need some kind of political authority and unity in order to drive that project forward in an incredibly hostile world.
That's right. And I mean, I think also this kind of binary between authoritarian, like bad authoritarians and good democracies, that it's also kind of an orthodoxy in the political science discipline, or at least certain pockets of it. I think in a way it's to distract from that Marxist analysis of the world, that there is a structural relationship between imperialism and capitalism that's keeping some countries rich and powerful and other countries poor and weak. And anytime you want to challenge this disparity in the global wealth and in the global standing, then they brand you as an authoritarian, and they say that it's justified for us to intervene to bring you, democracy and human rights. So I think people can see through it. And I think one reason that even the Trump administration has been so naked in its colonialism and aggression is because people aren't really buying the whole "I'm going to intervene on behalf of democracy" anymore. So they have to come up with other narratives and justifications, such as the narco state justification that kind of mimics the Hollywood narrative, and then also the beloved narrative of the liberals that there are these evil authoritarians that we have to get rid of. So I think your response was very beautiful, because in a way you're confounding that whole binary, and you're talking about democracy, authority, all these things kind of going together, and actually some level of authoritarian leadership motivating grassroots mobilization. So I really love that. And I think I actually saw it on your social media too. You were responding to some questions about this. And I think some people who will read it will be traumatized, or not traumatized, but I think they'll be confused by a response, because I think it takes a lot of reading to realize what you're trying to say here. Coming more to the present, if you want to talk about the abduction that happened on January 3rd. So is your assessment that there is a coup d'etat going on similar to 2002 when they tried to orchestrate a coup d'etat against Chavez? Or is it just that the Venezuelans couldn't really match the American military power, and there was no internal elements of basically turning him over to the Americans? So was there a kind of an internal thing going on here, or was it a purely American abduction?
I think these are great questions, and to some of them we'll need sort of time to sort of sort them out. But yes, for folks that don't know, there was an attempt to overthrow Chavez in 2002, April, in which a mostly internal opposition, leveraged elements of the Venezuelan military to remove Chavez from power, with the support, however, to be clear, of the Bush administration, right? And the attempts to remove Chavez were bipartisan, across the board bipartisan. They did, however, use slightly different means, right? And we're very familiar with this, right? The Democrats are a little more subtle, and the Republicans tend to be a little more brash. 2002 was not a CIA operation, although they were aware of it. They actually probably thought it was a bad idea, but they certainly endorsed it, right? Bush met with Maria Corina Machado, the so-called Peace Prize winner, who's an incredibly violent leader of the most fascistic elements of the Venezuelan opposition. Part of the reason that she has no standing in Venezuela is because she supported the coup in 2002. But what happened, as you know, in 2002 is that hundreds of thousands of people took to the street and demanded Chavez's return, right? And particularly because he was not whisked away to a court in New York, they were ultimately able to fracture support for that coup domestically, and to lead, and to force essentially Chavez's return to power. And not just Chavez, right? I want to be very clear about that. The return of the Constitution, which had been scrapped, right? A constitution that people had collectively and in a participatory way written over the course of 1999. Right. So that was an incredibly important moment in the Venezuelan political project. What happened on the 3rd is in some ways the same thing and in some ways very, very different. Right. It's of course a different moment. It was a direct act and strategy taken by the United States government. The U.S. government, as we know, and as they've been sort of incessantly crowing about ad nauseum, it leveraged an absolutely, outmatched logistical capacity to carry out a special forces operation. And I want to lay this on the historical terrain, right? Which is to say, the United States is increasingly a special forces military, right? And it is so because of the fact that they knew they could not lose a single American, right? They knew that it would be a disaster for them to lose an aircraft, which they almost did, right? At the same time. And yet, they wanted to carry out this operation. And I say that in part so that we can then gauge what is the capacity for the government to engage in, say, a second wave that Trump keeps talking about, which would not go down in the same way. So this was a surprise operation that used absolute logistical outmatch. I know there's a lot of talk about Venezuelan participation, and I'll say something about that in a second, but I want to emphasize the fact that the full logistical capacity of the U.S. military, the most powerful in the world, was brought to bear on this one small operation. So we should not jump to the conclusion that because it was successful, there must have been a conspiracy, right? Because the U.S. government, it's actually silly that they're so proud of having carried out a very small operation with all of the capacity, 150 aircraft, hundreds of troops, absolutely. The second thing to say is there was resistance, right? There was resistance on the ground. There were at least 80 dead. 32 Cuban soldiers were killed, right? And that is a testament to the fact not only that they were there, right, that the Cubans have been supporting revolutionary movements across the global South for decades, but also a testament to the fact that they were not helping the Americans, a testament to the fact that they stood and they protected Maduro and Celia Flores, and that they had to be mowed down, massacred even by the U.S. government, right? And that should be both, a sort of a point of pride for the Cubans, but also a sort of point of outrage for the United States, which is that they are not talking about the fact that they shot down 32 Cubans, right, to make this happen. They're acting as if it was the cleanest of clean operations. So there was resistance. Now, to the question of what actually happened, right? I'm not sure that we know, right? And everyone is in the process of sort of reading the tea leaves and trying to interpret the conciliatory behavior of the government. And there's an entire spectrum here, right? People are talking about overt cooperation. They handed Maduro over. Maduro even possibly handed himself over. But along that spectrum, is a whole range of possibilities, including the fact that they didn't know this was going to happen and yet now have to adjust to that reality, right? And to the fact that they're, attempting to buy time for this revolutionary process to avoid its full dismantling, right? Because, and I want to be very, very clear, about the fact that when I wrote We Created Chavez, the entire point of writing that book was to make very, very clear that a revolution is not the work of a single person, right? A revolution is not the work of a single person. My guide, actually, my sort of the only model I had for writing that book when I wrote it was The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James about the Haitian Revolution, which he himself had modeled on Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. When I read The Black Jacobins and when I was thinking about Venezuela, it resonated so clearly, right? Because you're talking about the fact that an individual leader, a Toussaint Louverture, Hugo Chavez, did not make a revolutionary process, but was himself made by that revolutionary process and that revolutionary possibility. And so I sought to find the sort of historical backbone of mass struggle that made possible the creation of someone like Hugo Chavez. And I found it in revolutionary movements, right? This revolution began long before Chavez. This revolution will continue long after Chavez, as it has. And yet you see the same mistakes being made today, where the U.S. government, for example, thinks, well, we've taken out Maduro, therefore the revolution is over. Or even people on the left who are either critical or sympathetic, will say, oh, well, now that Maduro's gone, the revolution is over. That is never how this revolution operated. There are hundreds of thousands of revolutionaries on the grassroots level. And if anything, they have a very, very different perspective on whether or not we should be sort of engaging in a process of conciliation with imperialist forces. Because the second crucial lesson of the Black Jacobins is that when a revolution attacks its own left wing, it is doomed, right? And without overstating the case, it's no secret that that those leaders currently in power in Venezuela are not the left wing of the revolutionary process, right? This is not to say, I want to be very clear, this is not to say that they've betrayed the process necessarily, but they are not the revolutionary left wing. And so it remains to be seen whether or not, they will be able to stand up and allow for a sort of reinvigoration of this revolutionary process, whether or not they will stop the process of, privatizations, process of conciliation, not only with U.S. imperialism, but with private capital, whether or not there will be any way to mobilize the grassroots against imperialist invasion, which was the point of, this sort of revolution. It was not the goal of developing militias and developing a grassroots, strategy of arming the people, was not to allow the military to then make decisions unilaterally in moments like this. It was to empower the people themselves to stand against U.S. imperialism, to both ensure the radicalization and the sort of revolutionary nature of their process, but also to be there on the ground, to be a sort of, a hornet's nest that U.S. military could never occupy. And I do think that's true, right? And that's part of why the logistical, sort of capacity was necessary for this kind of operation to be carried out. And it's precisely why, and explains very, very clearly why even someone like Marco Rubio, even someone like Trump is now having conversations with and speaking, this confused liberals and many others across the board to say, well, now we're going to work with the government, Delcy Rodriguez and others. But it's precisely because they know they cannot occupy that country. They know that any troops sent into Venezuela would be sent into a quagmire, and they know that that would not be something that would be politically feasible for them.
That's right. I think you're very right. And this is the general problem in the global South, is that whenever you have a revolutionary movement and a revolutionary government, there are elements that, they're looking to normalize with the capitalistic world order, and they want to normalize with the U.S. And for that, they're willing to serve as traitors. I mean, we also had that in Iran during the 12-day war. Is that some of the spies and elements of espionage were internal, and part of the reason is that they have a different ideology and they want to actually integrate Iran into the liberal global markets, and they don't have any patience or interest in the revolutionary politics. So, and I think this is a broader problem in the global South that really fractures. Because in the U.S., it's interesting to me that you could basically, socialism, minus very small spaces like the abolitionist school that you teach at in Philadelphia, where you have these kind of voices. In the mainstream, there's only capitalism and liberalism. You don't really have serious conversations about socialism or Marxism or other ideologies. But in the global South countries, I think it's much more fractured. And then the kind of the pro-capitalist, pro-liberal political parties and groups kind of really lessen that revolutionary momentum that any global South country could have in terms of destabilizing that structural relationship between imperialism and capitalism. So that's also a very welcome point. But regarding what you were talking about about the social landscape and situation in Venezuela. So, because I know you've taught in Venezuela. So what is the mood like in Caracas right now? Because we're hearing conflicting narratives, some saying that the majority of the people are celebrating, but others say that the majority are very angry and they're mobilizing against the American intervention. So what is your assessment?
Yes. No, again, we need to understand these things on the historical terrain. And the historical terrain is of a prolonged and profound economic and political crisis, right? The support that the Maduro government and now the government of Delcy Rodriguez can convoke in the streets is not the same today as it was under Chavez, right? This is the fact of economic crisis, and it is by design, right? The goal of U.S. economic sanctions is to force Venezuelans to oppose their government, to force them to vote against their government, to force them to vote them out of power. And then we're supposed to say that's a democratic outcome. This is what happened in Nicaragua at the end of the Sandinista revolution, right? And that's an explicit goal. And it pays dividends, right? Support, again, like I said, the Maduro government did not have the widespread support that the Chavez government could call upon. However, what's very interesting about moments like these, and this is really you mentioned hubris earlier, and I wrote a lot about about colonial hubris in my book, Anti-Colonial Eruptions. And the colonial hubris of this situation is really kind of breathtaking. It could be a profound miscalculation by someone like Trump, which is to say, many of those who might have voted for the opposition because they wanted a simple change of government within the country, simply because they're opposed to Maduro or critical of Maduro, does not mean that they support U.S. intervention, right? And the numbers on this are absolutely stark, right? You can have very low approval or very high levels of criticisms of the Maduro government, but no one wants the U.S. occupying the oil fields, because outside of a small but loud minority in Doral, outside of Miami, you don't have support for direct U.S. interventions in U.S. intervention, because we know that the tent of nationalism is far bigger than the tent of socialism, right? This is simply the terrain on which we operate as sort of organizers. And so what Trump is tacitly doing is reinvigorating a nationalist defense of sovereignty, right? And so that's part of what's going to be happening now. The difficulty, however, is that and again, I'm not inside Delcy Rodriguez's head or the head of Vladimir Pedrino or anyone, but the difficulty is that in this moment of crisis, there is an opportunity to say, we need to be very, very careful. We need to be conciliatory. We need to negotiate with the U.S. to allow us some breathing space. But what is happening in that context is demobilization, right? In the morning after the coup, all government leaders said, we reject this, we oppose this. In the afternoon, they said, go back to work, go back to school, go back to normal life. Right? In other words, there's a demobilization that is happening, and that is potentially dangerous. Again, the mobilization would not, strictly speaking, have stopped this kind of targeted operation. But there's enough mobilization, and there's enough political consciousness, and there's enough organized and armed opposition, to U.S. intervention in Venezuela, that if U.S. boots step, onto Venezuelan soil, it will be a nightmare for them. But that's very different from preventing these kinds of strikes. So you have this sort of this sort of very complicated constellation today between long-distance warfare, the potential for more bombing raids or targeted assassinations, which was my worry when it came to Maduro from the beginning. You've got a tension between that and the fact that the U.S. government knows that it can't actually occupy the ground. But the Venezuelan people, and here's where I, maintain my level of optimism, which is that consciousness is very difficult to destroy, right? Mm-hmm. It can be destroyed. That's what the dictatorships of the Southern Cone of Latin America did or sought to do in the 1970s by eliminating entire swaths of the population. But absent that, consciousness cannot be destroyed very easily. Right. And part of what has happened over the past 30 years is that Venezuelan people have grown by leaps and bounds when it comes to their consciousness. Now, that consciousness and that sort of new counter-hegemonic framework is in crisis because of the severe economic difficulties. It's exhausted, right? There's this phrase, agotamiento, right? This exhaustion of the revolution, in the sense that the revolution is not providing the alternative that it claims to provide or it needs to be providing. And that's something which saps the energy of that process, but the consciousness doesn't go away, right? And so one of the key questions moving forward is what's going to happen on the level of power and what's going to happen on the level of the grassroots. Because if there's anything that, my, sort of research and writing on Venezuela shows, is that there's always an inevitable gap between the two, and how the two relate to each other is actually the key to understanding the outcome of a situation. If the Venezuelan government conciliates with imperialism and attacks the left, then, it will be a kind of nightmare scenario, both for that government and for revolutionary movements. But if there can be a new sort of path charted from within Chavismo toward the left, then we could be looking at a reinvigorated revolutionary process. Although the reality is that the economic situation and the, basis for that is very, very, dire.
That's right. No, and I think you're very much right that because of the harsh economic conditions and the consequence of U.S. sanction and also internal corruption or whatever might be causing the inflation and the economic problems, people might be less likely to mobilize against imperialist intervention. But you're very much right that there will be a resurgence of that sovereignty and anti-imperialist consciousness once they see that, the integration into the American order doesn't really improve their welfare either. So I think this is a pattern of modern history that we have witnessed. But that's great on regarding the kind of the grassroots mobilization. And what I want to end with here, my last question, and again, thanks very much for joining us on your busy schedule. So my last question, and I hate to ask this question because I know you're a scholar, and I hate being asked, what will happen in the future, but I think our audience would be curious what your assessment would be of what will happen to Maduro, and also what will happen in Venezuela in the near future or perhaps the long-term future.
Yeah. I think, of course, it's a terrible question to try to answer, and attempting to predict is consistently an act of folly. The safe bet, unfortunately, is that we see the culmination of a process of accommodation with global capital, right? And I say culmination because part of the left-wing critique of what's been happening for the past 10 years under Maduro is that there has been, under the pressure of crisis, an accommodation with private capital, and a conciliation with, imperialist forces. Those sectors of the Venezuelan government that have been accumulating strength are the sectors that are probably the most likely to be willing to reframe and restructure the Bolivarian revolution to be compatible with capitalism. And again, that's a long-standing phenomenon, right? There's always been a tension within Chavismo between different sectors, among sort of nationalist reformist sectors and revolutionary grassroots socialist sectors, always. Right? And the question is, who has the upper hand? And those who have gained the upper hand are those who are probably more likely to lean in that direction. And this is a long-standing trajectory in Latin American history, right? Where revolutions come to power and then become reformist sellouts, right? And I hate to say that that's a possibility, but it's a clear possibility. And if it's, if you were a betting person, that would probably be where you would put your money. However, we live in incredibly fraught moments. The role of and space for contingency in revolutionary transformations is vast, especially in moments like this, by which I mean we have no idea what's going to happen in the U.S. government. We have no idea how long Trump's going to be in power. We have no idea if he's going to survive his term, much less, who would come after him. And so, with Trump out of power, things change dramatically. There are other possibilities. And again, we always want to remember that the primary drivers of history, here, there, everywhere, the primary drivers are the people, the everyday masses. And so the kind of sort of mobilization that can be unleashed in Venezuela will also be profoundly determinant. And again, if we know anything from the history of the Venezuelan process, that, the great sort of Venezuelan radical Roland Demings once, said that the Venezuelan process had the virtue of moving from event to event, right? Meaning from, the Caracazo to the coup, to the then coup against Chavez, to all these moments of mobilization that were able to sort of revitalize revolutionary energy. And if this can become one of those moments, then there is the possibility of a sort of revitalization of a more revolutionary government as well. But again, time will tell.
That's right. So we have to see what the future will hold. And thank you very much for joining us, Geo. And I hope to talk to you very soon.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.